The most important question aquarists can be asking themselves right after answering, can I care for the fish I'm looking into buying? Do I have the resources, the knowledge, and the know-how to keep this fish? Is, do I understand the conservation status of the fish that I'm about to purchase? Now, I have been very guilty of seeing an incredibly beautiful fish or a new species, so new oftentimes in the aquarium hobby that it's not even known by a scientific name. This is often the case in the aquarium hobby. It only has a trade name and no Latin name. And if that is the case, you can be assured that that fish has not been assessed by a scientific or academic source. There's no way that it has the information of whether it is even endangered or sustainably being caught out there. So the question becomes, are we becoming part of the problem for these fish, or is there a way that we can be part of the solution? So, for instance, if you are breeding fish that we do know are wild caught and we do know are threatened or maybe even endangered, you have to make that decision whether they should be caught at all and you want to be part of that, or whether you don't want to make the purchase whatsoever. But informing yourself is the first step. The second step is the part I'm hoping I can help you with today. You're going to have to make that first decision yourself with the information that's available. And unfortunately, 30% of freshwater fish around the world are already threatened with becoming endangered or extinct already. So today I want to look at some of the options out there, and say you want to buy a fish and own a species that is threatened or endangered or maybe even extinct in the wild. How can you be part of the solution rather than part of the problem of harming that species? There are a lot of different programs that exist out there. There's things like the C.A.R.E.S species programs, there's Project Piaba, there's different arowana farms that have licensing programs, and there's things like the Goodied Working Group. And each of these has a different strategy, whether that's a free market drive that funds things, or whether that is a personal obsession with something like the Castle Dawn Aquatics Group, where they have betta species that are endangered in the wild or even possibly extinct in the wild, and they are buying land personally and selling these species that are threatened from tank bred stock, yet using the money to then put real living wild stock back into their homes. So let's examine the different strategies today and what we can do as aquarists and what's working versus what is not working with fish conservation in freshwater fish keeping. Hello, my friends, and welcome to FISHTORY. Today I have a bit of an uncomfortable episode. We are going to be talking about the notion of fish keepers saving endangered species of fish. Now, when you think of endangered species of fish, you may not think of things like the 28 betta species that exist that are endangered. In fact, some of them almost no longer exist in the wild, and even fish as ubiquitous as the red-tailed shark, the denison barb, or the clown loach are nearly gone in the wild or are no longer found in the wild. Other fish like the Somphong rasbora or goodieds and several types of rice fish are also no longer found in the wild, and their only existence is within the aquarium hobby or in institutions like aquariums, zoos, and universities. But realistically, how often can our hobby save a species? And moreover, what species are out there and how can we inform ourselves as fish keepers of which fish are out there that are near extinction, and oftentimes they're not even listed or made illegal to buy and sell, even in Western nations that have a system for tracking endangered or threatened animals. And supposedly we are not allowed to be buying, selling, and trading these things. Fish like arowana are heavily regulated by international acts and by laws, for instance, within the United States, and we cannot own Asian arowanas here at all. However, there is a licensing program in Southeast Asia, and there are many farms that breed these fish. And even though this magnificent fish is nearly extinct in the wild, it exists in captivity as a very transformed domestic version of its wild self that is ever popular and getting more popular. It is being bred by the thousands, and there are many, many color morphs and different body styles and fin styles that are being bred. But is that preserving the species? Moreover, is it raising money that can go to conservation of these species by permitting and things like this? So let's talk about a number of case studies, and we can talk about everything from things like the devil's hole pupfish or goodeids that have completely gone extinct in the wild, or maybe there's literally one body of water that holds the genetic diversity of the entire species. And what does that look like when a government or an institution comes in and they control it versus what happens when hobbyists do this? And what can we do as hobbyists to learn of which species are out there even that we should probably not be keeping as fish keepers because we're simply incentivizing the last of those fish to be captured from the wild? This all started because I had a species of betta that I was excited to teach you guys about. And I learned that this betta is almost extinct in the wild. It can't be found for the most part anymore in the wild. However, private citizens are now breeding wild versions of this betta, and in a very organized and widespread, well-funded effort, they are able to likely save this fish and hopefully even reintroduce it, as they've done with goodeids and rice fish in the past. But on the flip side, I had a fish that I wanted to show you guys about that was an absolutely awesome fish that I was excited to say, everybody check this out. And I realized that as an influencer, if I tell you guys to go out and get these fish, I am playing a role in the destruction of this species, most likely. It has not yet been documented, and it has not yet been studied so that it can even be listed as endangered or threatened. And yet, it may very well go extinct, having its total wildlife footprint stamped out, while collectors are rushing to get the last of them right now. And the flip side of that, I thought, well, maybe we can incentivize more people that do care to keep these fish and to breed them. But alas, we don't have much information on how this particular fork-tailed loach even breeds, and we don't have much information on this fish at large anyways. So let's talk about different examples of each of these things that I've talked about, where the conservation is working and where the hobby is actually harming the preservation of different species of fish. The most important thing you need to understand before you buy that fish, as we already talked about, is its conservation status. Once you figured out that you can care for it, you need to understand that. And as I said, it is so difficult to know whether or not a fish is even threatened or if it's sustainably caught. And really, at the end of the day, it comes down to trusting the source you buy your fish from, paying the extra amount, or asking the extra questions, or simply knowing where they get their fish from their suppliers and having some level of transparency, or knowing the person who collected it firsthand. All of this combined with the scientific information needing to exist of understanding how many fish there are left of the species period can then be put together, and you can decide for yourself whether you feel comfortable caring for a fish. Now, a lot of people may assume that just because fish are available, that means that they're not at risk of going extinct. But that's simply not true. And in many cases, even if the fish is extinct in the wild, you can get it for $5 at the pet store. Or you can get a domesticated version of something like a betta that has been hybridized many, many times and no longer really resembles the fish that would be, genetically needed to reintroduce them back into the wild ever. So in a way, that fish has ceased to be, and it's almost a new fish or a new species that does exist in many cases. This occurs with live bearers and things like guppies and endlers, but also with goodeids and also with rainbow fish and cichlids that are from the rift lakes. So it's a very touchy subject, and you will need to decide for yourself with the information that's out there what you want to keep versus what you think is unethical to keep. In my mind, I only will keep fish that I can breed in captivity when they're wild caught or that are being sustainably caught. If I have a reasonable suspicion that they're in a giant river like something in the Amazon or a major tributary, and they exist for a large stretch of the river or multiple collection points, I feel pretty good at night about keeping a tetra or a pleco or corycat species. However, if it's a newer species and I don't even have a Latin name for it, I have begun to change my thinking about these things, and I am no longer as comfortable keeping these fish unless I know that they are readily bred in captivity. If I know that they can be bred in captivity, checking places like Fish Base or fish keeping clubs around the world, then I will feel more comfortable keeping the fish. You're going to have to decide this for yourself. But for me, if I can't breed it or it's not being bred, and I don't know that it came from a tank, I'm not going to buy it. I won't buy wild-caught fish that can't be bred if they're not sustainably caught or that information doesn't exist. And that is something new for me. I bought these fork-tailed loaches that I was so excited to tell you about, and I have a betta species that I'm still excited to tell you about. But the difference here is in how people have actually gone about preserving these fish. So with the fork-tailed loach, there doesn't exist a program right now to protect these fish. Palm oil plantations are actually taking over the last of the few places they exist in Borneo and Indonesia, and they are devastating the last of the peat swamps where they exist right now. So not knowing whether we can breed these fish in captivity, I no longer feel good about telling others to collect these fish or keep these fish. It seems like it is a rush on to collect and keep the last of a dying thing to simply say that you have it or saw it. And to me, that's no longer acceptable. And where you're going to draw the line is going to be different for everyone. So I do understand that, and you'll make your own decision and your own peace with that. But what I do want to tell you about, and what we're going to talk about right now, is the things that exist already adjacent to or within the hobby and working with the hobby, where people have said, yes, I want to keep that species. It can be bred in captivity and it may be extinct in the wild. Things like people breeding wild betta species, and they are actually helping by saying, I have these wild genetics, I'm making sure that I'm not interbreeding, I'm getting a hold of more tank-raised wild genetic fish, and I am supplying them to other hobbyists. Places like the Castle Dawn Aquatics project or other betta rescue projects exist where they've bought land out in the native region where palm oil plantations or logging or deforestation has actually taken over the habitat of these fish. And there may not even be any left in the wild in some cases. And they're reintroducing these betta and secretly keeping, protecting, and checking on the fish in these spots. They may only be 50 or 100 acres in some cases, but a little bit of money can go a long way in that part of the world where most of the tropical fish in the aquarium hobby are from. The equatorial world is much more affordable when you have Western money and the backing of breeding fish or a pet project by someone who's passionate about it. But there are other programs out there for other fish and other situations. So that's talking about a private program that is funded by the desire for people to keep that fish. On the flip side, it still incentivizes poachers to go get that fish if it's endangered or low in population. and to collect on them while they're fetching a good price, because these people who are doing it ethically require a good price to fund the whole project they're doing. So this also went on with arowanas. They were being caught from the wild at a dizzying pace right as they were nearly extinct, because they were worth so much more money as they became rarer. However, now there is a system in place to have them bought with licenses or permits. And so you can sell them based on their aesthetic and the time it takes to breed them and to keep such a big, powerful, hungry fish for 5, 6, 7 years in captivity, getting them ready to look, show quality, and keeping a 3-foot long or 4-foot long fish that is beautiful is expensive. These fish can fetch up to hundreds of thousands of dollars, but more usually they're going to fetch several $1,000s. And because of that, that can fund preservation efforts out in the wild still as well. And in the case of the arowanas, there are people trying to keep the wild genes alive in captive private preserves. There are also a lot of the fish that don't look anything like the wild caught version, and they are bright red or gold, or they have long fins or different traits that are very highly desired, and that is now driving the price up. So in the case of the arowana, I have no problem with people buying these tank bred, or farm raised rather, arowana, because they're no longer in competition with those wild form arowana that are maybe out there somewhere still hanging on to the edge of survival. And they're also raising money in many cases for arowana conservation as a whole and around the globe. Plus, it keeps the genetics alive and diverse. So, what other programs are out there for other species? Let's talk a little bit about the most extreme, which would be something like the devil's hole pupfish. Devil's hole pupfish is a little fish that lives in the California desert, a little killifish that there are only as few as 35 of sometimes. Yet, this fish will then rebound and go all the way up to 2, maybe even 300 individuals, and exists in one cave in one place in the Nevada and California borderland region of Death Valley. These fish are protected literally by cameras, cages, walls, wires, and barbed wire fences. They have scientists monitoring them all the time. They have chemical testing devices all the time. And they have people going and working with this species constantly. Plus, there are genetic life rafts of other populations now that they are keeping separately but nearby of a very similar subspecies in case something were to happen to this location. Now, obviously, this is seemingly working. They have protected it. But most places don't have the resources or the funding, or frankly, the people just aren't interested, or they're not in a part of the world where that is something that can be funded when people are facing a threat of elimination or starvation. So we can't expect that this model will always work, even though obviously it does. So I'm going to skip over the government and academic institution model where they are obviously preserving things, and I want to talk about the hybrid models, things like Project Piaba. That is a program that's working on the far side of saying, yes, this fish is sustainable. It works in the Amazon with fish catching people that spend their lives catching these cardinal tetras, and they deem that a fish is sustainably caught using methods that don't involve things like explosives or electrical devices or poison that can harm the river. Likewise, they're not harvesting from locations or places that are already low on the fish. So therefore, they're harvesting fish that would die during the dry season as their water dries up anyways. So they're literally fish that evolutionarily would perish. That's why they have so many babies in the wild, and that's why they're so numerous and a schooling fish. So Project Piaba is a great example of that, and I'd love to see more out there in the way of saying these fish are totally sustainable and we guarantee it. However, the flip side of that would be saying that a fish is not sustainable and, hey, we need help saving these fish. So if it's not cordoned off completely from being kept, if it's not an endangered species or an illegal species to keep, something like the Goodied program, they have put together an international group using university resources and government resources in places like Europe as well as Mexico to keep these little Mexican fish alive. Now, out of over 38 species of these fish, all of them are in trouble. However, some are completely extinct in the wild, with one or two being completely extinct that we know of already, altogether, with none left. And that is so sad. So in order to avoid that, they have been working with this species as well as another species out there, the Ameca splendens, or the split fin butterfly Goodied, and the tequila Goodied, which have been kept by fish keepers since the 1960s and probably a little before. And they were a popular live-bearing fish. So they were easy to breed in captivity, and their genetics were fairly diverse when you look at that there were Americans keeping, there were Europeans keeping, and there were Asians keeping these fish. And so when, in the 1990s, these fish went completely extinct in the wild, they were then able to restore the habitat that had been damaged since the 1970s. And in that 1970s to the early 1990s period, their habitat was thoroughly destroyed, and it didn't look like they could ever be reintroduced. Yet, in another 10 or 20 years, that habitat was restored, and further upriver from where they customarily lived, they were able to try test runs of reintroducing these fish, and they've been successful. So, what can you get involved in as a fish keeper if you want to keep a fish that is something like this and you want to actually do good? Because it's not enough to just keep a fish and say, hey, I'm keeping it, unless you're going to keep literally hundreds of those fish and do it out of the goodness of your heart. There are a lot of fish that simply aren't popular, and they're not going to bring you money or, connect you with people. And there are a lot of fish that need help. So you can be part of a program like C.A.R.E.S. That's C.A.R.E.S. And that's a program started back in 2004, which is a program that basically says, I have these fish that are threatened or that are extinct in the wild or that are endangered, and I want to keep them and breed them and pass on these fish to others as well. Now, this can be then tracked down by scientists or by ichthyologists, and later, if they ever want to reintroduce these fish, they'll have a list of people to contact, and hopefully they'll even have people that know the genetic provenance of their fish as well. Now, for some people, they say that, the average hobbyist is not organized enough, or we can't rely on that. And for some, they say that's not enough. You also see people who are very dedicated that are keeping the last of a species, or that have a pet project where they're keeping one or two species and they're keeping dozens of tanks of them, and they simply keep them out of the love of the species. And that's great when that happens, but it is not the norm. And it cannot be relied on that we can just hope that that's going on. So from my point of view, being a part of the C.A.R.E.S program or the Goodied Working Group program, getting in touch with the academic infrastructure that is researching a species, and keeping it only if you can spawn it, or obviously if it's sustainably caught, then go ahead and keep it. There's lots of stiphodon fish, little freshwater gobies that go out into the saltwater, and they're just not practical to breed in captivity. But it doesn't mean that they're not being sustainably harvested. However, it may mean that they are not being sustainably harvested. It just depends on the species and the location. But for me, I have had a change of heart, and I hope maybe you'll think about it a little more too, and only consider keeping species that we have a little more information on, or that are, if they are known to be part of the threatened species out there, that you can be a part of an organization to help keep track of them. So things like the Madagascar cichlids that are endangered and that are likely going to go completely extinct in the wild, they are in the C.A.R.E.S program, and yet hardly anybody keeps them. They need so much more attention, and it is these kinds of fish that I would like in the future to do species spotlights on, rather than things like my funky, fun, fork-tailed loach that unfortunately may just be going extinct. And I don't know what it takes to breed these things. So while it is a noble effort for those who are trying to breed them seriously, I do not have the resources to put the energy that should be donated to that cause. And I say, because of this, I am not going to buy fish in that category anymore. I hope you guys have gathered a little more information about what it takes to truly keep a fish that is on the risk of being endangered or extinct, and which ones you should keep versus which ones are kind of hopeless to keep. And you're kind of fooling yourselves if you're the only one keeping this fish just because it's available, and maybe a few people keep it, maybe even a few people breed it, but it's not part of an organized program. If that is the case, maybe you can be the person who organizes the program. I'd love to hear about it if so, and I'd love to hear about those of you who are a part of any of these conservation efforts. Please comment down below and let me know. Shout out so that other people who are watching this episode can also get in contact with you and link up, make the connections, and be a part of the solution. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I couldn't do this without your support, without you viewers, subscribers, the alerts, the likes, and of course, sharing the content. If you made it through to the end and you enjoyed this stuff and you think that it's valuable and someone else may get something out of it, please share this content. It means a ton to me. And if you really want to help keep the lights on, you can even subscribe for $1.99 or support me on Patreon or over on Discord. All right, you guys, have a wonderful day, and I will see you on the next episode of FISHTORY.